Okay, I like the idea behind challenge runs in principle, but I think most people that do challenge runs often fail to answer the question that they put in their videos, and so they aren't made around that idea. Because if you know anything about most Elder Scrolls games, if not all of them, then when the idea of doing a challenge run should be that you put a handicap on yourself to make it more difficult in some way. And the problem with pretty much all of them, especially Skyrim, is you can just have enough potions in your inventory to make yourself effectively invulnerable, or use enchantments to do huge amounts of damage and negate huge amounts of damage. Even if you don't fully exploit the system, like this Shiv video, he puts enchantments on his shivs. So shivs normally do, it's either 2 or 3 damage, which is some of the lowest damage in the game. But if you put enchantments on them and you make, he did like enchantments that do 10 damage, which puts them closer to kind of mid-ish game weapons. And it kind of undermines the idea of doing a challenge run entirely when you're just negating the weakness of it. So also blacksmithing. So any buff you can get from blacksmithing you can end up maxing out your damage resistance and getting your physical damage really high with most weapons in the game. So all of that stuff can already undermine a challenge run. So I wouldn't see the point. So these are other examples. Whenever anyone asks these questions, like with only, can you beat with only? They're always using items or equipment or enchantments. Like this, can you beat Skyrim with only your fists? He uses the pugilist gloves that have the unarmed damage fortification enchantment. And it's certainly beating the game by that, using that play style, but you aren't only using your fists. And the reason why that matters is because the game's made to be played this way. And if you're just playing the game as intended, I wouldn't generally consider that to be a challenge run. So, like Skyrim's, among other Elder Scrolls games, like they used to have an unarmed skill, an unarmored skill in the earlier games for a reason, because that was an intended play style, and there's still some remnants of that in Skyrim. So to me, just playing a specific build doesn't really count as a challenge run. And so I decided to kind of put my money where my mouth is and do something that's a little bit more restricted. So what I went with is, I thought the best thing to do is a challenge run where the main rules are you don't use items, don't use equipment, don't use any glitches or exploits. And I tried to, the idea is like, try to be as minimalistic about the stuff I use as possible. So the fewer things I can use, the better. And you might ask, why do this specifically? Because if you're trying to answer these questions that these challenge runs propose, making yourself near as weak and helpless as possible and using as few resources as possible would suggest that doing anything easier than that is likely viable. So you can actually come to the conclusion that certain other challenge runs should also be viable, because there's very few things that would be more difficult than what I attempted, outside of using legendary difficulty, survival mode, and like forks only or shivs only, depending on what's the actual lowest source of melee damage. So I didn't quite go that far, but I thought this would be an effective way to at least give the ability for people to implicitly reason that certain challenge runs are indeed viable. Okay, the beginning of the game's really simple and pretty easy. I get to Whiterun, I talk to the Jarl, I talk to the wizard, I go to Bleak Falls Barrow. It's easy until you get to the spider, and then it's a matter of punching it a couple of times and backing off and healing, and doing that until he dies. And the Restless Draugr give me a little trouble because I can only do 8 base damage, and there's no way to really for me to do more damage with the restrictions I have. And then I get to the end of the dungeon, and there's the Draugr Overlord, and I punch him a little bit and lure him into a trap, and he dies, because that's the faster way to beat him. I could have just punched him to death and ran away and stuff, but that would take longer. And I'm not against using the environment in this challenge run. So I take the Dragon Stone, I go to the Jarl, and then I confront the first dragon by mostly hiding in the tower, and he mostly fights the guards, and I pop out like once to punch him a little bit, and then I kill the dragon and get the first shout. I wouldn't say even anything noticeable happens until I get to the Thalmor Embassy part, because before that it's just another quick dungeon crawl and punching a few Draugr to find the note. So when you talk to Delphine, you go to the Thalmor Embassy. Because I don't have any items or equipment or pretty much anything, I don't sneak anything in. So this is the part where it's kind of like a huge difficulty spike. And if you're kind of doing what I'm doing, I'm trying not to use any skills either if I can help it. And the problem is the place is so close quarters that either you have to do enough damage to the Thalmor guards, you have to mitigate damage in some way, you have to use stealth in some way, or illusion magic in some way to actually deal with it. And I was literally just trying to fist everything at this point and not react in any other way if I can possibly help it. So really trying to do the minimum in any capacity. And so because I was kind of testing the waters a little bit, trying something that no one else tried before, this was finally a part where I felt like it was an actual wall, so I had to compromise on something. I started using shouts and it wasn't quite enough. I started using magic and it wasn't quite enough. And so I did what pretty much was a last resort for me, because it's compromising as much as possible for me. I lowered the difficulty, but I'm trying to see if this is even possible at all in the first place. And I'm not trying to do this in an optimal way. So I picked a Nord because it's like the default character, not because I thought it was an advantage. So it's enough room for me to fight my way through the embassy. And then really the game isn't a problem again after that until you get to the first Alduin fight. Okay, because of the nature of the Alduin fight, I don't think there's any way to really beat him without some form of healing, damage mitigation, or stealth, because he has that shout that calls down meteors from the sky, and it's hard to like spam clear skies and dragon rend at the same time, because your shouts are on a cooldown, especially if you can't use anything to reduce that cooldown. So I had to kind of hide out and use a combination of the fire breath shout and healing magic, and that's mostly what was able to get me past the fight. And I don't see how you could do it like 0 skills, barehanded, no items, no enchantments, because you'd have to at least use stealth, in my opinion. And I've been playing this whole way at level 1, by the way. You pretty much just jump into the portal to Sovngarde and punch Alduin to death, and it's way easier the second time, and that's the whole game. And I wasn't entirely satisfied with that, so I made a second attempt, and to prove a point that you can kind of optimize some of the challenge out of these challenge runs, I went with a more optimal attempt. Okay, my first attempt with a Nord, my fist damage was 4, and that almost proved to be enough, with the exception of the Thalmor Embassy and dealing with the first Alduin fight. The second Alduin fight has enough diversions and stuff. You don't even really need to punch Alduin, you just need to finish him off with the last blow. So that practically doesn't count. So base damage was 4, and I was only doing 4. Now the more optimal thing to choose is either an Argonian or a Khajiit. Khajiits are even better because they have a base damage of 10 like the Argonians, but they have a passive claw trait that adds 12 additional damage. And this brings you up comparable to some ebony or daedric weaponry if you have 1 skill and 0 perks and stuff. But still, that's a huge advantage, and I don't know if people realize how much of a huge advantage it is. Like, I absolutely decimated pretty much everything up to the Thalmor Embassy, no problem. Okay, kind of my attitude for this run was anything goes, so long as I'm not using items or equipment. So I did just kind of punch my way up to the Thalmor Embassy, but when I got there, it proves to be a little too difficult, being close quarters and stuff. And it's been on adept difficulty this entire time. But I decided to start using shouts for crowd control to get through the embassy, and that went smoothly. And then after that, to prepare for Alduin, I grabbed the Lord Stone at some point for a little damage mitigation, which I didn't have in my first run, and the werewolf form. And then I just went to the first Alduin fight and comparatively decimated him. At least, compared to my first run. Because the werewolf can hit like a truck. And that, it like trivializes everything I went through the first run. Kind of doing that. And if that sounds like cheating to you, that's sort of what every YouTuber does when they do these challenge runs, where they have some basic kind of rule and then they cheese it as much as possible in some kind of roundabout way to effectively remove the difficulty from it. So pretty much no one ever posts a failed challenge run, and it's fine if people want to argue my challenge runs don't count because I didn't do something right. And I'm going to post all the raw footage for my runs so that people can scrutinize them if they want to. But the only person I've ever seen post like a failed challenge run and talk about it and make it like a learning experience is J-Rose. And the video that comes to mind is this video of why you can't beat Gen 1 Pokemon with just Magikarp. And it has to do with there's a mandatory fight you have to go through with a ghost, if I remember correctly. And Magikarp only has a normal type move, and struggles a normal type thing, so it's impossible for you to get past that part in Gen 1. But people wouldn't learn this stuff if people didn't post their failed runs. And if we're trying to learn more about how to beat a game and what it is possible to do and not possible to do, people should be trying to do challenge runs centered around that idea. With what I did, pretty much a ton of equipment, there's tons of different equipment you could use exclusively that would make a run like mine into an easier run if you unrestricted that. One of the unarmed only runs used the pugilist fists, and again, if I did that and nothing else, it would have just made my run easier, and maybe I wouldn't have had to rely on anything else. But most people who do challenge runs for Skyrim just spam potions if things get too hard or something. And I kind of hate that because it totally destroys the idea of trying to do a challenge run in the first place. And to me, it's just not any fun or interesting when you go that far. You're just playing the game.